If you've just joined us, we're retelling the story of America's birth in 1776, due to the sacrifice of a small number of determined patriots. We pick up the story with the British isolated within the city of Boston, a peninsula. The harbor around the city of Boston is controlled by the British. The land, however, was controlled by 14,000 ragtag American militia, now under the command of General George Washington. And in the fall of 1775 there was therefore an impasse. The British were waiting for reinforcements. The Americans did not have cannon that would be required to win the campaign. So in November of 1775, Henry Knox offered to extract the French cannons abandoned at Fort Ticonderoga. This was about 250 miles away in upstate New York, and it was largely through wilderness. Now, General Knox, Henry Knox, who was later to become a general, arrived on December 5th in Ticonderoga, with winter fast approaching. They dismantled 58 mortars and cannon, and the whole lot weighed about 120,000 pounds. By boat and sled in the dead of winter, Colonel Knox pulled this load across New England. He arrived in Boston on January 27th, 1775, when the thermometer had dropped down to 4 degrees above zero, and he had not lost a single gun. In the interim, Washington averted a crisis. Enlistments expired on December 10th, 1775. So of his 10,000 men, only 1,000 agreed to stay. On January 1st, 1776, King George's speech to Parliament suddenly arrived in the Americas. The reaction by the American patriots were rage and indignation. Many returned, and 9,000 men became available for the spring campaign in Boston. Overlooking Boston were twin hills known as the Heights of Dorchester, and from here cannon could be mounted and they could pound Boston at leisure. The British, knowing the American lacked cannon, they chose to ignore the outpost. After all, they had to only deal with the rabble. Washington, with Knox's cannon, now put together a plan to occupy the heights. And over February, while the British were enjoying city life and warm fires, the Americans prefabricated breastworks to carry up Dorchester Heights. On March 5th, 1776, the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Cambridge, the American army snuck up to the Dorchester Heights in the middle of the night. Now, a diversionary attack started on the opposite side of Boston, while 3,200 troops shimmied up the hill with hundreds of carts, heavy wagons, and prefabricated redoubts, and the cannon. The British discovered it in the morning to their surprise, and so they attempted to shoot the Americans off of the heights. But this demonstrated that cannon from ships could simply not be aimed high enough to hit the hill. The day after the British fired off their 50 cannon salutes to the Americans, about 700 of the cannonballs were collected. The Americans gathered them up and fired them back at the British. British General Howe then tried to mount an amphibious assault in the middle of the night, but the hand of Providence intervened. With a squall of snow, sleet, and winds like a hurricane, the troop ships were sunk or driven back. On March 8th, General Howe sent Washington word that he was abandoning Boston. He threatened to burn the town to the ground if Washington would impede their withdrawal. And so on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1776, the British put out to sea. But Washington feared that they would go to New York, where Loyalists abound, and from New York City they could cut the colony in half. Fearing the British invasion of New York, Washington sent his army south. He arrived on April 13th, 1776, and he was met by his wife, Martha Washington. In describing the battle for New York City, it was important to visualize the geography. Now I want you to put your right hand up, turn it palm up. The center of the palm is New York City. Now trace up to the first knuckle of the second and third finger. This represents Manhattan. The line from the center of the palm up to the first finger is actually the East River. Now, the East River is this sort of funky little estuary. It's a secondary channel to the Hudson River seeking the ocean. The East River and the main channel of the Hudson actually meet at the base of Manhattan Island, where New York is located. So the line from the center of the palm up to the pinky on the left side of your right hand is the main channel of the Hudson River. Okay, now what to do with the thumb? Well, the thumb, if doubled in size and length, would represent Long Island. The border of the hand from the tip of the pinky down to the wrist actually represents the shore of New Jersey. Staten Island is represented by the little mound of the palm on the side of the pinky. Slightly below the wrist is a waterway called the Narrows, which flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. All of this territory, the Narrows, Staten Island, or shall we say the wrist on up to the mound of the palm, was Tory country, loyalists, royalists, elitists, statists, progressives, and liberals who spoke of the commonweal, but they expected very special privilege. Hey, has anything changed over the past 230 years? Woof. A week before Washington's arrival, William Tryon, the royal governor of New York, boarded the HMS Asia, a 64-gun man-of-war, and he drifted downstream to the Narrows, down where the wrist is, and from here he directed a secret loyalist operations against Washington. Major General Charles Lee was Washington's second-in-command and the only professional soldier officer in the American Army. A former British officer and a veteran of the French and Indian Wars, he would be at best called an odd duck. He was spare in body, and he had a long hooked nose with a dark bony face. He was more than rough in manner and speech, and he had nothing of Washington's dignity. Even the uniform he was in would perpetually look unkempt, like a character out of a Dickens novel. And he had a rather colorful past, including service with the British Army in Spain. He married a Seneca chief's daughter in America. He was an aide-de-camp to the King of Poland at one time, and much, much more. He was a character. But Washington considered him the best military mind of any of his generals. Congress appointed him second in command of the American Army. General Lee had been sent to assess the defense of New York. He concluded that it simply could not be held without command of the sea. It turns out he was correct. Yet Washington and Congress were also correct that if New York was the key real estate in the entire continent, commanding New York allowed the British to control the Hudson River all the way up to Canada, and thus the British could divide the colonies and control the continent. Washington and his generals were convinced the British would be sailing in from the horizon at any moment, so the troops started digging immediately. Now he had 8,800 men, and he had reliable information that the British had hired 17,000 German mercenaries called Hessians, and they were on the way. So a fort was constructed above the tiny hamlet called Brooklyn. Brooklyn, if you recall, was at the base of the big thumb in this geography we've been talking about. It was at the base of Long Island. And at that time, it only consisted of about 6 to 7 houses on a bluff that overlooked the East River, but it controlled Long Island. There were a series of forts built along Manhattan Island. Noteworthy were the twin forts in the north of the island of Manhattan on either side of the main stream of the Hudson. Remember, that's the Pinky, and across from the Pinky on the Jersey side. Fort Washington was the top of Manhattan Island, and on the New Jersey side of the Hudson was Fort Lee. The guns of these two forts were to block the upper Hudson and keep the British ships down below. On June 29th, 45 British ships suddenly arrived and anchored below the Narrows. The firepower of simply the 5 biggest ships exceeded every cannon that the Americans had available. On July 2nd, 1776, the Armada landed on Staten Island. Remember, that's that little mound of the palm there. And this territory was friendly to the king. Now, Providence does have a sense of humor because the Continental Congress had just voted to dissolve the connection with Great Britain, called the Declaration of Independence, 2 days earlier. And so on the 6th of July, when the British were in Staten Island, there was great celebration going on over in New York. Well, the British misinterpreted the celebration in New York as in support of them. But in actual fact, it was a celebration of the presentation of the Declaration of Independence from Britain by the Continental Congress to the people of New York. And so the Battle of New York was engaged. British ships kept arriving in groups of 5 to 20. By August 12, 1776, over 400 ships were anchored in the lower Hudson River. It was the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century made by any nation. There were 76 warships, 8 men of war with over 50 guns, 32,000 troops who were landed on Staten Island. The principal British leaders were General William Howe, who had been defeated in Boston, his brother Lord Richard Howe, and General Henry Clinton, and General Lord Charles Cornwallis. On August 22nd, the British and the Hessians, the Germans that is, struck. They landed beyond Brooklyn, 15,000 strong with 40 artillery pieces, and another 15,000 landed shortly afterwards. Although the Americans fought fiercely, the outer defenses were breached by a flanking maneuver through a secret pass revealed by Loyalist farmers on Long Island. The rebels were beaten back to Fort Brooklyn, and 40,000 men were involved in the battle on both sides that day. That's 40,000 guys shooting at each other. General Howe, of course, reported a glorious day for Britain. His losses out of his troops, 30,000 troops, 59 killed, 267 wounded. Needless to say, their guns weren't terribly accurate in those days. The Hessians lost 5 killed and 26 wounded. And the rebels yielded, according to General Howe, 1,000 prisoners and 2,000 were killed, wounded, or drowned. Well, in actual fact, 1,000 Americans were taken prisoner in the pincer maneuver, but only 300 were killed or wounded. The Hessians gained a reputation at that battle of giving no quarter. That is, they would bayonet Americans who had surrendered. What had saved the day was that the British Navy could not get their ships up the East River due to the strange winds swirling and blowing down that river. Washington came across the East River that night to assess the circumstance, and he realized instantly if the British Navy had been able to get into the East River, the 9,000 troops would be caught between the Navy and 30,000 British and Hessians. He decided to retreat. As at key points in the Boston campaign, General Washington called upon Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen to recruit all of the available boats in New York City and to get them across the East River and to evacuate 9,000 troops from the Brooklyn fortress in the dead of night. And once again, the hand of Providence intervened on that night of August 29th, 1776. The temperature dropped 15 degrees and a drenching downpour fell throughout the night. The British decided to hold off their final assault then until morning. Meanwhile, 1,200 Pennsylvania sharpshooters kept harassing fire into the British lines. They actually caused more casualties in the middle of the night than had been caused in the battle the day before. These Pennsylvania riflemen also lit campfires throughout Fort Brooklyn, and they gave the appearance of an extremely large army. Now, on the morning of Friday, August 30th, 1776, the British found, to great astonishment, that the Brooklyn fort was simply abandoned. 9,000 troops had escaped across the broad estuary known as the East River, and not a single life was lost. Most of the artillery had been evacuated to Manhattan. Now we're retelling the story of America's birth in 1776 due to the sacrifice of a small number of determined patriots. Please come back after these important messages and listen to the further story of 1776.